Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is Yanshan Wang. I'm a assistant professor of health informatics and vice chair of research at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also the NLP working group chair-elect at the EMEA community. So today my presentation is about natural language processing for clinical excellence, the state of practice, opportunities, and the challenge. So before diving into the topic today, I'd like to introduce some fact in today's artificial intelligence. So AI is one of the most interesting field of research today. And actually not only academia, but also in industry, AI is becoming a hot topic and has attracted a lot of investment. The growth and interest in AI is due to the recent advance in deep learning, particularly due to the outstanding performance of deep learning in many challenging tasks and the successful applications of deep learning in the real-world product. We all know that the Turing Awards were given to three pioneers in actually deep learning in 2018. And language is the most compelling manifestation of intelligence. So human language is the more complex behavior on the planet, and human language allows us to have language. So if we can teach computers to fully understand the language or speak the language, so the computer may have the intelligence to pass the Turing test, but we are still very far away from that point. So let's talk about electronic health record. So we all know that electronic health record is the longitudinal health record of the patient health information collected by one or more encounters in the healthcare delivery setting. So following the High-Tech Act law in 2009, many healthcare institutions have adopted EHR system, and the size of the EHR data increased dramatically in the past decades. So if we want to promote AI and which is a data-driven approach in healthcare, we have to leverage the rich information and knowledge from EHR to support patient care, improve the outcome of clinical practice. However, the reality of the EHR data is that 80% of data is embedded, 80% of useful information is embedded in an unstructured format. So for example, clinical notes, patient-provided information, radiology reports, pathology reports, and only 20% is embedded in structured data. So for example, demographics, lab tests, medication, diagnosis. And therefore, NLP is a key technology nowadays to deliver better care through data. So here is a snapshot of what data is available in EHR. As you can see, the EHR data contains rich information about the patient health. It goes from lab test, medication, diagnosis, and vital signs. And a lot of the data contained in unstructured format, like lab report, clinical notes, radiology report. So the EHR data are generated to serve the clinical care and facilitate billing, which means they are not made to optimal for research purposes, not optimal for secondary use. So here are some facts of using structured EHR data. So for example, ICD code for heart failure has only 57% sensitivity. The ICD code for Alzheimer's disease and dementia has only 8 to 86% sensitivity, 56 to 100 specificity. So, and a lot of information, for example, family history, lifestyle, social and behavior determinants of health, the so-called SDOH, is only available in unstructured format. So today we are going to cover three topics: how NLP is used in clinical care, digital phenotyping, clinical and translational research, and NLP for health consumers. So historically, NLP can be categorized into two classes based on the method. So in the 1970s and 1980s, NLP is called symbolic NLP or rule-based NLP, that people can design several rules to process the language and define the category for the language. As we enter the machine learning or era, the NLP becomes a statistical NLP. which use machine learning and deep learning techniques to automatically learn the patterns from the language and then make the decision. So a lot of questions has raised in the clinical domain, which approach is better for the clinical NLP, whether machine learning based NLP or rule-based NLP. So here I want to mention that it's not about selecting the fancy technology, but more about understanding the strengths and weakness and the nature of the project, and particularly in the clinical domain. For the rule-based NLP, we need to have some training data, and we as human beings to define the rules to extract the label for the language. For the machine learning and deep learning based NLP, we have the training data, and sometimes we need to have the gold standard or the labels so that the algorithm could automatically pick up the rules, and then we use the model to predict the end same data. So when we think about which is the right approach in clinical applications, we usually think about in two perspectives. First perspective, data perspective. So for example, what is the size of the data? If we have a large size of the data and the variance of the data, for example, if we have so many patterns in the data, we tend to use deep learning or machine learning techniques because we have so much data to learn from. But if we have only small size of data and if there are only a small number of patterns, we tend to use rules or dictionary lookup approach. And this is particularly true in clinical domain because in many cases, we only have a small number of patients or small number of gold standard. That's why we choose to use rule-based approach. And we also need to think about the user perspective. There are two dimensions here, whether the user need customizable algorithm or interpretable algorithm. If the user need a more customizable algorithm and more interpretable algorithm, we need to think about the rule-based approach or dictionary lookup approach because those approaches are very easy to interpret. But if the user is okay with the customization and interpretability, we may think about deep learning and machine learning approach because they are more black box approach. So, and a lot of times we need to consider both perspectives when we work on the clinical application. And in the following, I'm going to talk about several topics of clinical NLP in clinical domain. The first is the clinical NLP for digital phenotyping using EHR. So let me talk about the rule-based NLP first. So this is not the focus of today's topic, but I would like to briefly go through the rule-based NLP approach that we have been used in clinical application and clinical research. So this is several sentences from clinical notes, and a physician or clinical researcher want to extract the mutation, gene mutation from this clinical note. So this is more like entity extraction tags. So there are several steps when we try to extract this entity or when we try to extract this concept. The first step is a sentence detection. So we have to detect how many sentences in this clinical note. And then for each sentence, we do the tokenization to split the sentence into tokens, or in other words. And then we identify the concept from the tokens. So in this case, it's P53, which is a gene mutation. And next, we have also do assertion because it is not uncommon that in clinical note, there are so many negation mentions. So for example, this is the patient has no such disease. And in this case, this is a possible mention or hypothetical mention. This is also very common. So we have to do an assertion here to extract the certainty of this concept. And then we have to apply specific rules to extract this concept. And usually those rules are regular expression that we observe from the training data. And then we extract this concept and also normalize this concept. So in this case, this is a P53 mutation, and this is a possible mention. And to validate this algorithm or to validate this pipeline, we also need to do a manual chart review and create a gold standard data set and use that gold standard data set to validate or to evaluate this algorithm. So this is the pipeline of rule-based NLP. And on the left-hand side, this is the NLP system. So there are many rule-based NLP tools available nowadays. So for example, the Spark NLP, developed by the John Snow Lab. And we also have several tools in the research in the academia. For example, cTAKES, MedTagger, Metaspacey. Those are all freely available tools available for all the researchers to use. And as we enter the statistical NLP era, we are using machine learning and deep learning techniques to extract those concepts or to extract those entities from clinical language. So for the machine learning pipeline, we usually have a large number of text data, and then we transfer all those text data using the language features. So here we usually pre-process the text data and use language feature, for example, TF-IDF features or semantic or synthetic features to represent the original text data. And using the feature representation in the downstream machine learning tasks, for example, sentiment analysis, classification, entity extraction, those all can be formulated as machine learning classification tasks. And for the deep learning pipeline, instead of transferring all the text data into features, we actually use deep neural network to learn the features or to learn the embeddings of the text automatically. So here we don't need to think about what features we need to extract, right? That's why deep learning is also called representation learning, because we try to learn a representation that is better, that can be better represent original text and then embed most information in the original text that could be used in the downstream application. For example, classification, sentiment analysis, entity extraction, etc. So for the clinical NLP, for the machine learning based NLP, this is a very typical pipeline. We have a lot of clinical narratives. And in order to train the machine learning model, we need to label those clinical narratives and create training data. And use the training data. Actually, we need to create a gold standard and split the gold standard into training and testing. Use the training to train the machine learning model and use the testing data to validate the machine learning model. So here we actually have, as you see, we need a lot of human effort in this pipeline. The first effort is we need feature engineering. So using the traditional machine learning model, we need to think about what features we need to use to transform the text data. For example, whether we use TF-IDF or what kind of semantic features, what kind of synthetic features. This is really time consuming, need a lot of domain experts. And secondly, we also need to annotate the clinical text. And because the machine learning is a data hungry model, we need to have a large training data for the machine learning model. And here, again, we also need a lot of domain experts, particularly in clinical domain. And because clinical text contain the PHI information, we couldn't use cross-sourcing or this kind of technique that widely used in general NLP. We have to hire the domain expert in the local institution to annotate these clinical narratives, and which is usually very time-consuming and very expensive. So that's why our team proposed a new clinical text classification paradigm for NLP. So we call this weak supervision for clinical NLP. So instead of you hiring some clinical annotators to annotate the clinical data, we try to build a very simple rule-based NLP system here to use the rule-based NLP system to annotate this data, because this is annotated data is not annotated by human beings, but it's annotated by an algorithm. So that's why we call this a weak label. It's not the true label. And then we use this weak labeled data to train the machine learning model. And instead of using the human-crafted features to represent original text, here we use word embeddings features to add the representation for the text data in the machine learning model to train the machine learning model to extract the information from clinical text. And then we test the machine learning model on the ancient clinical data. And in this study, because we want to test the real performance of the machine learning model, that's why we actually hired several human annotators to annotate the clinical data for the testing data. So in this study, we observed that the weak supervision, even though this clinical data is with weak label, it's not the true label, but it's weak label. But because we can annotate as much data as we want using the algorithm, and the machine learning model could pick up the real patterns from those clinical data and then do the and have a very good performance when we test the model on the gold standard. Later on, we try to use neural language model instead of the traditional machine learning model in this framework. So basically, we don't need that one embedding features anymore because those neural language models, for example, BERT, BioBERT, or Clinical BERT, they have been trained using clinical language data. And all the features, all the clinical language features have been embedded in the weight that they learned from the pre-training phase. So we can just adopt those pre-trained language model in this framework and train the model and fine-tune the model on the specific test, specific clinical information extraction task. And we have this study, we tested this framework to identify major depression disorder, MDD, which is a disease from the clinical node. And we observed that the neural language model could actually outperform all the traditional machine learning models in the clinical NLP. And the second topic is clinical and translational research, how NLP could be used to facilitate clinical trial recruitment. So this is a clinical research pathway, very typical pathway. Whenever a clinical researcher have a research question, they need to design this protocol to the protocol will explain the details how to carry out this clinical study or carry out this clinical trial to answer this clinical question or to test this research hypothesis. And when they design the protocol, they have to study the feasibility of the protocol. So that is, they have to study whether we can recruit enough patients for our study. So if they cannot recruit enough patients, then this protocol is not practical and cannot be carried out. And they also need to identify the patients for the clinical trial and invite the patients in the clinical trial, do some pre-screening, consent, and after they got the data from the clinical trial, they do some analysis on the result and then report. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two key components in the clinical research pathway that will determine whether this clinical trial or whether this clinical study will be successful or not. So one is feasibility. So you have to show that you have enough patients to recruit. And this feasibility study is also critical for this clinical trial or clinical study to be funded by the federal government or the pharmaceutical company. And second is identify patients. You have to recruit the patient, identify the patient, and recruit them in the clinical trial or in the clinical study. So those are the key critical components in the clinical trial or clinical study. So we all know that the randomized clinical trials are fundamental to the advancement of medication. However, clinical trial recruitment remains the biggest barrier to clinical and translational research. So nearly 85% of clinical trials fail to retain enough patients, and only 3 to 5% of cancer patients participating in clinical trials, even though up to 20% are eligible. So our goal here is to leverage the NLP technique and AI technique to facilitate the clinical trial eligibility screening and to facilitate the patient recruitment. So here we have a lot of patients, and our goal is to identify the eligible patients and recruit them to provide the advanced treatment. Okay, and all those patients are actually represented by the EHR data in our data warehouse. And we try to use that EHR data and build a big tool that this tool combines the digital phenotyping infrastructure, combine NLP and AI technique, so that we hopefully using this tool, we hope to expedite the patient screening and increase the patient recruitment rate for the clinical trials. So this is a very high level framework, and this is a specific tool we designed for this purpose. So I'm going to skip the detail of this tool, but here I want to mention because in the EHR data, as I mentioned earlier, we have structured EHR data and unstructured EHR data. We want to use both information from structured EHR data and unstructured EHR data. So the current tools available, for example, the I2B2 and those cohort explore tools, they only consider structured data. They didn't consider the information from the unstructured data. But there, as I mentioned, there's so much information from unstructured data. So our tool actually combines both information from structured data and unstructured data. We use OHDSI OMAP common data model to transfer the structured data and index all the structured data in our system. And at the same time, we use Elasticsearch, actually, which is information retrieval search engine to index all the text data in the unstructured EHR. And here we also adopt OHDSI OMAP common data model because we want to make sure our tool is generalizable to any institution. And then we use a machine learning model to combine the information from both information stream and then retrieve the relevant patient that according to the input search query. So this is a very high level introduction of our system. And here is a screenshot of the system. So it's actually very similar to a search engine. So a researcher or a physician could type in the search query, so which is criteria for cohort or criteria for the clinical trial, and then submit this query. And then the system will parse this query using the NLP engine. So first it will parse this query, map this query to the structured data, and also match the query to the unstructured data, and do the search on both data format. So this is a screenshot of the return page. So we provide a patient level view because this is very helpful when you try to recruit a patient. And we rank the patient based on the similarity score. If the patient is highly relevant to your search query, it will be ranked higher in the return page. And those are the each document represent the patient. And we also provide document level view because we want to provide some evidence that why this patient is relevant to your search criteria. And those documents, those are clinical notes, provide evidence why this patient is relevant. And we also rank all the documents of the patient based on the relevance score. So there is another idea or another thinking of how to retrieve the patient or how to identify the relevant patient to the clinical trial or clinical study. So because all the patients are represented by the EHR data, so can we train an AI model to represent the patient using similar to word embedding? So can we represent the patient using this embedding format? So when there is a clinical trial, can we identify those eligible patients and then use some similarity measurement and identify a larger cluster of the similar patients so that those patients may be eligible for this clinical trial? So this is the idea for the patient representation learning from the EHR data. And this is our first attempt to find the answer, to find the machine learning model to learn the patient representation. Because from this slide, as you see, because we don't have any We don't have any supervised, we don't have any label when we learn the patient representation. So this framework, this model, AI model must be unsupervised. That's why we propose unsupervised machine learning model. And our first attempt is to use the topic modeling approach to learn the patient representation. So we used LDA, latent directly allocation, to learn the patient representation from the EHR data. And then we found the LDA actually tended to cluster patients based on their age, because when patient is aging, they tend to they tend to have more disease. And LDA just tend to cluster those patients, older patient in one cluster, younger patient in another cluster. However, this is not very useful, because sometimes we think the disease mechanism have some hidden patterns, even though some patients may have different disease, may have different ages. So that's why we propose a novel topic modeling approach. We call that person directly model, PDM. So using this model, again, I'm going to skip the detail of this model, but we published this study in the Journal of Biomedical Informatics. So using this model, we can do two things. So first thing is patient representation learning. So we can learn patient representation and then cluster those patients based on the representation. So this one is very useful for example, the personalized care, personalized diagnosis or treatment and prevention. So second application is disease representation. So we can find disease clusters using this model. And those disease clusters, they have they have two applications. One is it could enhance the disease risk prediction, because if some disease always uh, come together, we call that comorbidity. If some disease is always comorbidities, we can enhance the disease risk prediction using the disease cluster. Because this is totally data-driven approach, we may also discover some new underlying disease mechanisms that has not been discovered nowadays. So if you want to check more details, you can check our study here. So the third topic is NLP for health consumers. So as a consumer or as a patient, we always have a need for the information. So particularly during the COVID pandemic, we have a lot of misinformation from the media and a lot of information from social media. So, but during the pandemic, it is really time consuming, and actually we have a lot of shortage of human resource to create such information that is useful. So that's why we want to validate, or we want to test whether those language models, NLP language model, could be used to automatically answer patients' questions related to COVID. So this is a framework we define. So yeah, again, if you want to know more detail, you can check our study. So the basic idea is, if a human asks a question about COVID, we can use the GPT-2, which is language model, and this language model has been fine-tuned on the COVID-related materials, patient education materials, and we use this language model to automatically generate an answer for the human's question. However, GPT-2, the language generated by GPT-2, sometimes some sentences are not relevant. So we add an additional layer on top of GPT-2 using BERT to filter out some irrelevant sentences. So so those examples are based on the uh, based on the answer generated by GPT-2. As you see, some answers actually are very relevant to the question asked by the patient. Another application is, as you know, nowadays people are using a smartphone to view their health record from the hospital. However, sometimes the clinical notes or those reports are really lengthy. It's really long and cannot fit into the mobile phone. And also the patient may not, the user may not have the patience to read through all the clinical notes. So that's why we try to adopt the clinical text summarization technique to summarize what is the main finding, what is the main message from the clinical note. And in this case, we actually used echo report from the MIMIC3 dataset. And we try to use NLP model called BART, which is a language generation model to automatically generate the summary of the echo report. So at the end, I want to introduce several challenges in clinical NLP. So the first challenge is the data, because in the clinical domain, all the clinical data, clinical text data has PHI information, and because of the HIPAA rule, we cannot share those clinical text data freely or publicly to any researcher. So actually, this hampers the advancement of clinical NLP techniques. Another problem is the generalizability and the portability issue of NLP system, because each healthcare institution adopt different EHR system, and a different EHR system. So, for example, I can give you an example in our medical center UPMC, the inpatient system EHR system is different from the outpatient EHR system. There are two. So even within one institution, there are two systems. So let's don't mention how many systems will be available in the whole nation. So the portability and generalizability of the NLP system is really an issue, because when you develop NLP system on one institution's data, can this system or can this algorithm be generalizable to another institution, which use a different EHR system, which has a different clinical workflow, and the clinical notes, clinical text data is also totally written in a very different way. So this is really a challenge in clinical NLP. And there are also, even though there are many public corpus available for clinical NLP, like I2B2 dataset, MIMIC3 dataset, and STS corpus, which is actually created by me and my colleagues. But those datasets are available under data use agreement, and usually those datasets contain very small number of clinical notes. And the last, again, interpretation of the machine learning and deep learning models is really a problem, because as the domain expert, physicians, they want to know when the problem make a mistake. They want to ask why there is a false positive, why there is a false negative. And usually it's hard to interpret using those black box systems. There are also some health equity and social determinants of health issues in clinical NLP, because when we develop the clinical NLP algorithm, the data biased towards a certain population, to a certain education population, right? So those determinants of health actually defines the bias of the data that we use to train the clinical NLP system. And if the clinical NLP system is not trained using unbiased data or using equity data, the system might be biased towards a certain population. So that will lead to health equity problems, right? And again, even though a lot of people have been working on clinical NLP, but clinical NLP is still underutilized. If you compare to the use of electronic health record, there are so many people, so many studies using clinical EHR data. However, on a still very limited number of studies using NLP. That means only a limited number of studies using the unstructured data from the EHR. Okay, that's all for today's talk. Any questions?